I asked for your favourite Ninjabike backpack builds to help me help you, and you really came up with the goods. So I spent the last month testing them thoroughly, and I discovered the 7 secrets you need to make a killer Ninjabike backpack build. Many people love the rate of fire boost from the Striker's gear set, but can you use the Ninjabike backpack to add this to your gear set builds and take them to the next level? Let's look at the 3-piece ongoing directive 2-piece Strikers build that one viewer was using. The ongoing directive gear set buffs weapon damage for you and your team through hollow point bullets, while the rate of fire buff helps take down enemies faster to replenish the ammo. Or does it? The answer comes down to time to kill. If we replace the Ninjabike backpack and Strikers gear with Picaro's holster, a badly rolled Grupo backpack with vigilance, and one extra piece of ongoing directive gear of course, how do the builds stack up? To test this, I set up a simple side-by-side comparison in the firing range, both starting with hollow point rounds. How long would it take each to kill 4 named enemies? Using the Ninjabike backpack to add the Striker's rate of fire actually slows down your time to kill, and it takes 6.5 seconds longer in this test. And this is the same for any gear set combination with 2 pieces of Strikers, with a Brandset backpack always being the better option. The key takeaway from this is that using 2 gear sets with the Ninjabike backpack is rarely a good option. You lose out on too many attributes and talents by doing so. But what about using the Ninjabike backpack with the Striker's gear set for a DPS build? The Striker backpack is the strongest DPS backpack in the game, and I can show you why by a quick comparison of the damage buffs. The most common Brandsets used with the Striker's Ninjabike builds are Walker Harris, which adds 5% damage to armour, and Sokolov for its 15% critical hit damage. Using the Striker's backpack instead of the Ninjabike will provide a 35% multiplicative buff to all weapon damage, and an extra attribute for say 12% critical hit damage. It is pretty obvious that the pure Striker build will deal way more damage, in fact slightly over 14% more than the Ninjabike build. Now you do gain a skill tier with Ninjabike, which, let's be frank, is not that useful for a DPS build. You also gain 1 armor core, but if you rolled 1 piece of your Striker build to an armor core, you would have exactly the same survivability and still deal nearly 8% more damage. But does this only apply to the god tier Striker's backpack? Well no, because I would include gear sets like Negotiator's Dilemma, which one of my viewers was using with the Ninjabike backpack. This gear set lets a solo player deal AoE damage, mark up to 3 enemies, 5 with the chest piece, by dealing critical hits to them. 60% of critical hit damage dealt to a marked enemy is also dealt to other marked enemies. Using St. Elmo's with this gear set is a great option due to its 20% critical hit chance and critical hit damage mods. The player is also using Picaro's holster and 1 piece of Lengmo for the explosive resistance. In legendary content, grenade throwing tanks are a real pain, and I'm not going to knock someone for wanting some protection from that. The Ninjabike backpack is adding 1 skill tier and 25% skill health, which means that the build can run a Crusader shield with a very impressive 5.9 million health. I'm going to pause here because I'm actually really impressed with the shield's health, and it's given me some ideas for different builds. Back to the roast though, because there is one thing that this build is missing out on that is a complete game changer. The Negotiator's Dilemma backpack comes with the talent Critical Measures. This talent increases the critical damage dealt to other marked enemies from 60% to 100%. That is a massive increase in your potential damage output. So my suggestion would be to swap out the Ninjabike for the gear set backpack and add a 2nd piece of Lengmo instead of Picaro's holster. Also, to keep the build consistent with the fundamentals of the original, let's roll 1 piece of the gear set to an armor core, the reason for which will become apparent shortly. While this build deals 30,000 less each critical hit to a single target than the Ninjabike version, it deals 108,000 more when 2 enemies are marked, rising to over 500,000 damage more each critical hit when 5 enemies are marked, a massive 37% increase in damage output. And because we took that extra armor core, the shield will still have 4.2 million health, which is more than enough for most content. The key takeaway from these two builds is that Gearsets with strong backpack talent should be avoided when using Ninjabike backpack. The two additional attributes you get from the Brandset pieces and two cores are not enough to make losing out on a strong talent worthwhile. But which Gearsets fall into this category? My own personal list would include Strikers, Negotiator's Dilemma, Eclipse Protocol, Ortiz X-Zero and True Patriot. There are also some that are essential in specific scenarios and borderline at all times. Future Initiative, where big heals for stacked groups are essential. Heartbreaker when tanking the hardest content. Ongoing Directive for bleed builds. System Corruption in PvP encounters. And Umbra Initiative where you need faster and stronger armor regeneration. Let me know in the comments below which Gearset backpack talents you couldn't live without. So should we ever use Ninjabike backpack with a Gearset build at all? To answer that question, let's look at a viewer's hybrid build that combines great weapon damage with strong skills. 3 pieces of striker, a feminist chest with glass cannon, a ballsy choice for a striker build, the Ninjabike backpack of course, and a Picaro's holster rolled to a skilled core, in order to get to an effective 6 weapon damage cores, 4 skill tiers and 1 blue core. A FAMAS with Future Perfect is then used to get to a full 6 skill tiers, and overcharge every 90 seconds. Rolling every attribute and mod to critical hit chance and critical hit damage gets to 55% critical hit chance and 93% critical hit damage. I have to say, this is a really nice build, with the drone doing a great job of distracting enemies and dealing damage, but giving up on the 35% multiplicative damage from the striker's backpack is a bit like cutting an inch off your penis in exchange for larger balls. To make this build more fulfilling, I would swap out the feminist chest for a Brazos one, with the same attributes but roll to an armor core, and your weapon damage will increase by 14%. You do lose 1 skill tier, but given the damage output of the drone is just a fraction of the weapon damage you do, your overall damage will still be up massively. And because you hit harder, you kill enemies faster and max out your skill tiers quicker with Future Perfect, eliminating the difference anyway. The issues with all these Gearset builds comes back to how the Ninjabike's talent works. You get the most out of the Ninjabike by having different pieces of gear in each slot, because that will add 5 additional bonuses. With Gearsets you gain at most 2 bonuses and lose out on 1 or 2 attributes and a talent. But the question I know that you want to know is whether there are any Gearsets that work better with the Ninjabike backpack. All of the builds we've looked at so far have great backpack talent. What about one where the talent is so-so, like Foundry Bulwark? This is actually one of my builds which I've been using for solo Legendary Summit runs. The build started with a simple thought. The Defender drone is a stalwart of PvP but seems to be rarely used in PvE, despite the fact that my skill tier 6 Defender drone delivers 58.5% damage reduction. Couple this with a tier 6 Crusader shield and its effective armor is 12.9 million. Layer on top the Foundry Bulwark Gearset bonus, which repairs 35% of damage taken with the chest piece talent. And I have a build that can withstand nearly anything that legendary content can throw at me. A Picaro's holster rolls to a yellow core, adds 2 skill tiers and 15% weapon damage, while the Fox's prayer knee pads are used for their damage to targets out of cover. With 6 skill tiers, 4 weapon cores and 1 armor core, this is a great build and it works incredibly well. But if you swap out the Ninjabike backpack for a Brazos backpack with Vigilance, and Fox's Prayer for an additional piece of Foundry Bulwark, and you end up with a build that has just as much survivability and actually deals more damage. So a mediocre Gearset backpack is still not a guaranteed reason to use the Ninjabike backpack. But I did find one exception where it is, and it was all due to the Brandsets used with the Gearset. This is a Ninjabike Hotshot sniper build, and the Brandsets in question are Habsburg and Heroldi, whose bonuses are perfect for this type of build. The Habsburg's second bonus was buffed with Project Resolve from 15% to 20% marksman rifle damage, and it is this small change that makes all the difference. If we were to replace the Ninjabike backpack and add an Heroldi backpack with Vigilance, then our overall damage output remains largely unchanged, but we lose out on 1 armor core and 1 skill tier, and it is that fine margin that is the difference. There are no other Brandsets that work as well as these two with Ninjabike, so the key takeaway has to be Gearsets just don't work well with the Ninjabike backpack, so stick with Brandset builds where you're getting the most benefit from its talent. Solo players are a specific category within the Division 2 world who are often looking for builds that do more than just one thing very well. They need builds that deal great weapon damage to take down enemies quickly, strong skills to deal damage and reduce incoming damage, and the ability to tank more damage when they are the target of every enemy. This is exactly what one of my viewers was looking for with their Striker hybrid build. So this is their Ninjabike build. 3 pieces of Striker, Picaro's holster, and a Bellstone Armory chest piece with the talent Obliterate. With skill tiers from the Picaro's holster and Technician specialization, and 15% weapon damage from Picaro's, this build is effectively running at 5 weapon damage cores, 3 armor cores, and 3 skill tiers. One of the key things that the player talked about is the survivability that the 3 skill tiers gave them, due to the 4.7 million health of their Crusader shield, coupled with the Artificer Hive to provide it with constant heals. So this is the first thing I want to talk about, and to do that I'm going to compare the Ninjabike build against one with the Memento. The Memento build will have a 5-minute buff of 30% weapon damage, 30% skill efficiency, and 3% armor regeneration, and for 10 seconds after you pick up a trophy you will gain an extra 25% weapon damage, 5% skill efficiency, and 20% bonus armor on top of this. Enough to get you harder than a redneck at a family reunion. Most people have no idea how good skill efficiency is. Skill efficiency is a little like weapon handling, but on fucking steroids. It adds skill damage, haste, status effects, repairs, duration, and health, making it the best attribute for any skills. With no stacks, the Memento Crusader shield, not surprisingly, has less health and slower regeneration than the Ninjabike build. But wait, in just 5 minutes you can get max stacks and increase the health of your shield by 1 million. And for 10 seconds after picking up a trophy, its health will just be 142,000 lower than the Ninjabike version, which is a bit like comparing 6 inches to 6.25 inches. No one will notice the difference. Then there is the Artificer Hive. The key stat here is the skill repair. With no stacks, the Memento provides nearly 13% less healing to our shield, but at max stacks it is under 4%, and with the bonus just 2%. By the way, check out the duration and health increases you get with the Memento. If you're using something like the Restorer Hive, that sort of buff makes the Memento even more appealing. So that debunks the theory that Ninjabike skills provide more survivability than Memento. The other factor though is that for this build, Ninjabike delivers 10% more armor on kill from the Bellstone Armory chest piece and 1 additional armor core. However, the Memento delivers 3% armor regeneration and 20% bonus armor every time a trophy is picked up, which for me is just as good. The second thing I want to look at is damage output. With this build, the Ninjabike backpack provides no damage buffs whatsoever. Not a sausage. Memento delivers a 30% weapon damage buff, which is increased to 55% for 10 seconds after picking up a trophy. To put that in perspective, in the range, the Ninjabike build delivers around 4.5 million DPS and crits for 555,000 against armored enemies. With just the 30% weapon damage buff, the Memento delivers around 5 million DPS and crits for 629,000. With essentially the same survivability, the Memento delivers significantly higher damage output. Now, we've already covered the builds with more Brandsets work better with the Ninjabike backpack due to the additional bonuses that are unlocked, but does Ninjabike outperform Memento with these builds? This viewer's build is a great example of a hybrid Brandset Ninjabike build to test exactly that. It comes with 1 piece of Walker Harris, which unlocks 5% weapon damage and 5% damage to armor, 2 pieces of Palisades for 10% armor on kill, 60% health, and 1 skill tier, Picaro's holster for 10% skill haste and another skill tier, and finally Fox's Prayer knee pads for its 10% rifle damage and 30% accuracy. With the 15% weapon damage attribute of Picaro's holster and 1 skill tier from the Technician specialization, this build is effectively running an impressive 5 weapon damage cores, 5 skill tiers, and 2 armor cores for excellent weapon and skill damage. Weapon damage is provided through the named rifle Harmony, which comes with the talent Perfectly in Sync, which when activated buffs weapon and skill damage by 40%. The rifle is fitted with a Technician's Link laser pointer, pulse enemies, and proc the chest piece talent spotter for its 15% amplified weapon and skill damage. Overall weapon damage is buffed by 145%, damage to armor by 5%, damage to target's outer cover by 18%, and amplified damage of 15%, with 50% critical hit chance and 87% critical hit damage for some very solid weapon damage indeed. Skill damage is buffed by 70%, haste by 20%, duration by 10%, and amplified damage of 15%, making your striker drone and assault turrets capable of taking down enemies on their own. 1.1 million armor, 561,000 health, approximately 1% armor regeneration, and 10% armor on kill rounds out the build for some solid survivability. This is a very good build, but it could be even better. I've replaced the Palisades chest piece with a unique Wyvern wear chest piece that is rolled with critical hit attributes and the same spotter talent. I have to be honest, I'm not a fan of the Palisades gear set. When my armor breaks, my natural reaction is to dive into cover, so I find stacking excess health is just a waste. But I wanted a compromise with the fundamentals of this Fierce build, which allows me to use a named piece of gear that you never see in builds, but it always sounds so fucking awesome. Death Grips. This comes with 30% health, 10% armor on kill, a blue core, and I've rolled it to 12% critical hit damage, which is perfect. A red core Brazos mask with skill and critical hit damage replaces the Walker Harris mask, and along with a yellow core Picard's holster with critical hit chance adds 2 skill tiers and effectively 2 weapon damage cores. I have changed the attributes on the Fox's Prayer knee pads to skill damage because I don't need the armor regen from it. And that's because I'm using the Memento backpack. At full stacks, this build will have 10% more weapon damage and 12% more critical hit damage, the same amplified damage and critical hit chance, but does lose out on 5% damage to armor, leaving the builds fairly similar on gunplay. But where the build really shines is around its skills, with 40% more skill damage, 30% more skill haste, 30% more skill health, and 30% more skill duration, turning the drone and turrets into absolute fucking monsters. The key takeaway from these builds is that for solo players, the Memento backpack delivers unparalleled buffs to every area of a build, making it a stronger option than the Ninjabike backpack in almost every case. But the Memento backpack is not the only exotic that can help create build diversity. This Fierce Ninjabike backpack skill build is again a very good build, using 2 pieces of Empress International, a Hanyu chest piece rolled with the talent Overwatch, Picara's holster, 1 piece of Walker Harris, and the Ninjabike backpack of course. All pieces in the build are rolled to skill damage and skill haste, as this build focuses more on skills than weapons. This build immediately ticks many boxes for me, using 4 different Brandsets to deliver 2 armor cores, 6 skill tiers, a weapon damage buff of 50%, skill haste buff of 88%, skill damage of 90%, skill health and duration of 20%, and damage to armor of 5%. As we've seen many times over by now, the Memento backpack will deliver a stronger build for solo players, and in this case this can be done by just swapping out 1 piece of Walker Harris for another Empress International. At full stacks the build will have the same 2 armor cores and 6 skill tiers, but higher weapon damage, higher skill damage, higher skill haste, skill health and skill duration. Weapons and skills hit harder, have more health, and stay up longer. But I also came up with a unique alternative build through the imaginative use of some unique pieces of gear. The first of these, the Fenris named chest piece, Ferocious Calm, buffs the capacitor's damage output through 10% assault rifle damage, and comes well rolled with skill damage and skill haste. Its talent Perfect Overwatch has the benefit of Overwatch, but takes 2 seconds less to activate, which is a nice hidden buff that really makes a difference. A Wyvern wear backpack adds 10% skill damage to the perfect attributes it already has, and comes with the talent tech support that adds 25% skill damage for 25 seconds after a skill kill. Now the talent combined arms is also an option, which adds 25% skill damage for 3 seconds, but it puts too much pressure on you to stay out of cover firing all the time, which I don't think is ideal. These Contractor's gloves are perfectly rolled with a skill tier, skill damage and 8% damage to armor. This Bakaro's holster along with a Brazos knee pads adds 2 skill tiers, 15% weapon damage, an armor core, 22% skill haste and 20% skill damage, which is pretty impressive for just 2 pieces of gear. The final piece is one that might surprise you. Catharsis Mask. With this piece the build matches the Ninjabike build with 2 armor cores, adds up to 30% weapon damage and drops a healing cloud which heals for 50% of your max armor. This adds some much needed survivability that was missing from the Ninjabike build. The weapon damage stacks let this build deal 7% more weapon damage, while the turret and drone damage is almost identical. The key takeaway here is that Ninjabike is not the only exotic option if you are looking for build diversity. The Catharsis Mask, Vile Mask, Memento, Bloody Knuckles, Ridgeway's Pride and others can all open up some interesting options. Not the Ninjabike Messenger knee pads though, these really are awful. There is a tendency for Ninjabike backpack builds to try and do too much, to deliver the highest DPS, the strongest skills and the most survivability, when in reality the build would be much better if it focused on one core thing. The next view's build is a great example of exactly that. The build uses 5 different Brandsets, which is the god roll for Ninjabike builds. A Group A mask unlocks 15% critical hit damage and 20% explosive damage, while China Light knee pads adds a further 15% explosive damage and 20% skill haste. A Hanayu chest piece unlocks more skill haste and skill damage and comes with a talent glass cannon. Bakaro's holster rolled to skill damage unlocks 10% skill haste and 1 skill tier. One piece of Bellstone Armory rolled to skill haste and skill damage adds some survivability with 1% armor regeneration and 10% armor on kill. The fundamental core of this build is all about explosive damage, and so it's odd to use the gunner specialization for its 10% armor on kill rather than looking for more explosive damage output with Demolitionist. The reality is that when you use glass cannon, any heals are used to top you up rather than save your life, as you take damage too quickly for that to happen. The best way to stay alive is to kill everything quickly, and ideally from cover while your skills do all the work. The other thing about the Demolitionist specialization is that it opens up access to the artillery turret. Let's be honest, explosive skills are a bit hit and miss, and with Seeker Mines, it is often miss. The only 2 that I feel comfortable about are the sticky bomb and the turret, so for me Demolitionist is somewhat essential. The other thing about these skills is that damage also scales with skill tier, skill damage, damage to armor and damage to health, which opens up a very unique build. So I've swapped out the Group A mask for the named Jarl mask, Hollow Man, which comes with health damage, which is a straight buff to my explosive damage output. I've also swapped out the Hanayu chest piece for a Wyvern Wear one, which adds 10% skill damage for its bonus. Because we are using an artillery turret, I don't need as much haste as the Ninjabike build, so Hanayu is less optimal. I am running a second piece of Brazos for the skill tier, and these knee pads are perfectly rolled for the build. I do want to keep one piece of China Light though for its 15% explosive damage, and I've gone for the name Backpack Strategic Alignment. This comes with a talent Perfect Shock and Awe, which buffs skill damage by 20% for 27 seconds when a status effect is applied, which the artillery turret does. So always lead with this skill. The final piece is an interesting one, Death Grips. Having some healing is useful to top yourself up while your skills are doing all the hard work, and the extra health adds just a little bit of time to get to cover if your armor breaks. Now you could also use Contractor's gloves for the damage to armor to buff your explosive damage output even more, but for me that was pushing my survivability just a touch too much. These changes increase your explosive damage output by 10%, nearly 20% if you go with the Contractor's gloves, making the small drop in weapon damage redundant because everything is already dead. And that makes for a simpler, more focused and better build. I would also put into this category builds that have distinct purpose, like support builds. If you're running a support build, then support the team. This healer build is a good example of that. It uses the classic healer gear set Future Initiative, which is a great start. A Murakami chest with the talent Empathic Resolve, which leans into the support role even more. Every piece of gear is perfectly rolled to repair skills. So what is the Ninjabike backpack doing in this build? Firstly, it unlocks 30% repair skills from the Murakami gear set, which is great. Secondly, it unlocks one skill tier from Bakaro's holster, which lets the build have one additional armor core, which for a build that has this much healing potential is just flipping redundant. Bakaro's holster also adds 15% weapon damage to buff the damage of the capacitor, which is somewhat redundant as this isn't the focus of the build. The capacitor talent also buffs skill damage, which this build doesn't have any of. What would make more sense is to run 4 pieces of Future Initiative and an Alps Summit backpack with a talent like Opportunistic, which amplifies your entire team's damage to a target by 10%. Couple this with the Scorpio shotgun to proc the talent, and at 7 stacks, its talent will also buff your entire team's damage for a further 20%. The fact you can also CC enemies with this weapon is just added benefit for everyone. And to top it off, your repair skills will be exactly the same between the two builds. The key takeaway from these two builds is that with your Ninjabike builds, keep them simple. Focus on 1 or 2 things to do really well, rather than trying to go for a build that does everything averagely. I saw a few builds that went deep into a brand set in order to pick up the 3-piece bonuses, like this build. Now the viewer did note that they had rolled pieces to red cores where possible, but we will go with what we have here. But the thing that I really want to focus on is the 2 pieces of Lengmo and 2 pieces of Brazos. What this build does well is only focus on 2 things: LMG damage and magazine size. The problem is how they've got there. The other bonuses on the Lengmo gear set are explosive resistance, which is situational at best, and skill health, which is useless for an LMG build because you can't use a shield to get any use out of it anyway. Then you have the 1 piece of Heartbreakers that adds 15% LMG damage. Sounds good, but you also have to think about what you're losing out on by using it. If we'd used a brand set, we would have gained an additional bonus on this and an additional attribute. Then there is the 2 pieces of Brazos, which unlocks 50% additional magazine size, but this also comes with 1 skill tier and skill haste, which is pretty useless for this build. The concept of wanting a larger mag with an LMG is a good one because it addresses the key issue with most LMGs, the reload speed. But using 2 pieces of gear for just 1 attribute just isn't worth it. But let's leave the larger mag size for now as the feature of the build. If you swap the Heartbreaker mask for a Walker Harris mask, the Lengmo chest piece for Providence, and the Lengmo gloves for Contractor's gloves, your average damage per shot would increase by a huge 24%. The other thing to think about is the diminishing returns you get with 2 pieces of a brand set. 1 piece of a brand set with the Ninjabike adds 2 bonuses, but adding a further piece only adds 1 more bonus, making it less worthwhile. So the key takeaway from this is that it is better to go broad rather than deep on brand sets with the Ninjabike backpack. So these are the 7 secrets of Ninjabike backpack builds that will help you create the best builds possible. Thanks to everyone who submitted their builds for me to look at. You are all legends.